Hello guys, today I'm going to be talking about 10 tips that will help you make your Minecraft forest feel a lot better, more interesting, and even more realistic. Now this is another entry in a kind of unofficial series I've been doing about terraforming, forest, and how to make interesting trees. But today I want to focus on the forest specifically. So without further ado, why don't we jump right into it? Tip number 1. Trees are going to get either wider or thinner depending on how much sunlight they get. So if you're trying to build a lone tree out in the middle of a field, you're going to want to make something like this. It's going to get sunlight on every side, so it's going to have tons of big bushy leaves all around it in order to soak up as much sun as it can. On the other side, a tree that is standing deep in a forest is going to look something more like this. You're going to see that it doesn't have a lot of foliage down below, and the biggest part of the crown is going to be around the top. It's also probably going to look a lot more slender, and effectively the deeper into a forest you go, you'll probably find more trees that look like this than that look like this. There is one exception to this, and this is wolf trees. Wolf trees are trees that used to stand out in the middle of a field and have slowly become surrounded by forest. So you can see that even though most of the trees around them have more of this kind of thin, less bushy shape to them, wolf trees are still going to retain that kind of circular shape because they used to have sunlight all around them and they just didn't really grow up in the same environment as everything else. Now, speaking on the way that forests kind of grow up, you want to decide an age for your forest. I've come a little bit away from there to show you guys all of the different tree sizes that I have come up with. Now you'll see that a lot of these are really small sapling sort of trees. On the other hand, we also have some like this one that I just showed, or these two trees here that are more in line with what an adult oak tree might look like. If you want your forest to feel old and ancient, try not to include so many of these little guys and try to really include a lot of these big older trees. An older forest full of older trees is also going to have a ton of foliage and stuff on the ground. The older a forest gets, the more seasons it goes through, the more dead wood and saplings and dead leaves, the more bushes and dead bushes and all sorts of things it's going to collect at the forest floor. So a younger forest you might want to keep sort of sparse. On the other hand, an old forest is probably going to be absolutely packed top to bottom with all sorts of stuff. So we're here now outside of my medieval town, Brewerstown, in order to talk about forest management. You can actually see a little bit of it right away. These people have been clearing away the forest progressively, and you can see a bunch of tree stumps all around the edges of the forest. When you're making your own forest, you want to decide whether your forest is managed or not. If you're building your forest next to a big old town like this, where people are regularly going into the woods, it's probably going to be pretty heavily managed in a few important ways. Now, one of these is that they might be involved in clearing out the bottom levels of the forest. These people are hunters, which means that they're trying to chase animals through the forest. It's a lot easier to do when you're not running into all of that dead growth and underbrush I was talking about. Another reason that the underbrush of your forest might be missing is if people are grazing their animals. Now, a really common one that people might be grazing in the forest are sheep and goats because they will eat basically anything. But they might also be coming in with pigs or cows or whatever other animal and feeding them the kind of underlayer of the forest. Of course, since we're next to a big town, they're going to be coming in here for firewood, so we can also talk about how there are no dead sticks and trees down at the bottom, because those are really easy pickings for people to collect to warm their houses. And of course, if people are regularly coming into the forest to do all these things like animal grazing, trapping, hunting, collecting firewood, and so on, well, there might be a path that runs through your forest, or a bunch of little sort of hunter paths. With forest management, we can also talk about tree varieties. Now here there are only 3 types of trees. We have poplars, oaks, and elm trees. But a place where people are trying to manage the forest actively might have a lot more fruit-bearing trees. They might be trying to spread apple trees or citrus trees, or you might find a lot of berries around the floor level. So when you're deciding what kind of trees you want to put into your forest to begin with, you might want to consider whether or not this is just a random forest in the middle of nowhere, or this is near town and people are going to be coming in and trying to kind of micromanage the whole place. Tip number 4 is to make trees of all types, all sizes, and all ages. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to include every single species in the world in your forest, but what it does mean is that for the species that you do include, you might want to have some dead trees like this. Or you might want to have trees that are crooked and leaning over. You're probably going to want to have some little baby sapling trees, and you might want to have some really old looking trees like this. I like including trees that look like they have a little bit of decay in them sometimes. So this one looks like it might have some dead leaves near the center of it. Although you can also find trees around here that are in different levels of dying. Of course, when you have these big older trees, you're probably going to want to cluster them around the center, both because it makes a bit of sense, and also because it helps kind of ease the gradient into your forest if there is a natural rise and fall to the tree line. Sometimes people ask me how many of these tree varieties does a forest really need? And my answer is realistically like minimum 10 and ideally about 16. So you're going to want to have a bunch of trees that go from the tippity top all the way to the smallest trees, and you're also going to want to include some dead varieties and some crooked varieties along the way. This will be easy to show you if we go back to the test world and take a look at some of our snowy trees. So we're here in the test world again in a bit of a different area, and here you can see a bunch of trees laid out from the tallest to the shortest. The tallest one here is actually a dead tree, and if we go throughout, you can see that there are a couple of crooked trees, a couple of trees that are missing leaves and stuff, and down at the bottom we have another dead tree. We have gotten all the way down to number 15. So I think about 15 trees like this is enough to make a convincing looking forest. The more trees you kind of come up with, the less you have to put effort into trying to disguise how similar they all are. Another thing you can see if you fly up in this part of my creative test world is that we have a bunch of different types of trees all near each other. And this is because when you're doing your forest and you want them to feel realistic, look up what species of trees and bushes and shrubs naturally exist near each other. For my own purposes, what I did with this area is I looked up what species are most common in Newfoundland, Canada, because I'm trying to create a town that has a kind of North Atlantic feeling. So I came in with some jack pines to represent the highest layer of the canopy of my forest. Around the middle layer, we have these balsam fir trees. These are basically Christmas trees. And you can see that the tallest of them don't quite reach the tallest levels of the pine trees. On the other hand, at the bottom of the forest, we have a bunch of these big sprawling juniper bushes. And for dots of color, we also have some elderberry bushes. And if we fly over to here, you can see that I was also playing around with some quaking aspen. If we combine most of these together, then we can get something that looks a little bit like this. Here you can see that on the top levels of this kind of sparse foresty area, we have our jack pines, and then down near the bottom we have our balsam firs, and then right on the forest floor level, we have our juniper berries and our elderberries. We also have a bunch of ferns, and in the more open areas, we have researched what sort of flowers would like this area, and we came up with poppies and azure bluets. Both of these are flowers that thrive well in these sort of mountainous alpine areas, and combining these all together, we get a good feeling for what a realistic looking forest might look like. But I want to show you guys what a forest looks like when you don't take into account what species naturally coincide. So here we have a forest that is a little bit of a mess. You can see this is actually the back side of the forest because it's meant to be seen more from this angle. But here we have a mix of cypress trees, Lebanese cedar, longleaf pines, and stone pines. And even though these are all trees that like a similar kind of environment, they are from different parts of the world. And you can see that when you try to combine them all, you end up with a weird sort of feeling where nothing quite feels like a realistic forest. Something about it just feels a bit off. It's not terrible, but if we had done the research properly, like we did for the forest over there, we would have created something that feels a lot more put together. Now, tip number 6 is figuring out when each type of tree got to your forest. Now, there are a couple different ways to do this. Obviously, you can look up like what kind of tree tends to inhabit an area first. This is called a pioneer species. Pioneer species are really important because they're going to change the soil in important ways for other species to then come into the area. On the other hand, there are species of trees that will only really come into an area when all of the pioneer species have been wiped out. So here you can see that there is a dead tree, and around the dead tree we have a bunch of these little poplars. And this kind of pattern is repeated throughout the forest. So whenever one of these big trees falls, a bunch of poplars tend to take their place. Well, it means that for all of those little kind of dead and crooked trees that you built into your forest already, try clustering around them with a bunch of smaller trees from another species. You can get a lot of storytelling out of your dead trees and by dictating what's going to be regrowing around them. On the other hand, if you focus on your pioneer species, you can create some cool effects where there is just one or two trees standing out into a field, way past the regular forest edge, where they're kind of trying to slowly expand the forest, but the rest of the forest just hasn't quite caught up yet. So your pioneer species are going to look great on a single solitary hill, and eventually these will become our wolf trees. Now, I briefly mentioned soil types. Not every tree, not every plant or shrub or flower is going to want to be in the same soil, and you kind of intuitively know this. When we build our willow trees in Minecraft, we tend to place them down by the river here. On the other hand, if we go to the tops of our mountain peaks, we expect to find these little Christmas trees. There are some things that just feel good and just make sense when we're building our Minecraft forest. Actually doing the research though into what sort of trees like which types of conditions will help you a lot to make your forests feel realistic. I imagine that the soil up here is really thin and rocky. In fact, underneath this little thin layer of grass, there is absolutely zero dirt showing. There's just a thin layer of kind of loose soil and then it's straight to rock. So we don't have a ton of super tall trees here, and in fact, we don't even have a ton of trees at all. A lot of this is either empty or it's filled in with little saplings and shrubs and grasses and flowers, things that don't need a lot of deep soil. If we flip around, we can see that this forest is a little bit more full and it's actually right next to a volcano. So we can imagine that maybe the volcano is making the soil here really good for growing trees. Point being, research your soil types and you will come up with a much more realistic feeling forest as you start to place trees where they naturally belong in the real world, instead of sort of willy-nilly wherever you can copy paste them. Getting back to our poplars, we can talk about invasive versus native species. Now, technically, invasive to native is more of a sliding scale. Consider your invasive species and what they may be doing to local species. Minecraft can be a great way to explore these tensions in the natural world between the things that we bring and that may be useful or invasive, and the things that have adapted to the environment in a more peaceful sort of way. If you're trying to build something in a sort of colonial North American setting, like I know a lot of people like to do, building things like forts and recreating early towns like Boston and New York, well, you might want to include a lot of invasive species around where the colonists are setting up, and that will really tie into your world building. On the other hand, if you're building something like a little nomads camp, well, maybe the nomads spread wild grasses and wildflowers wherever they go, which can be considered invasive. So you could imagine a field full of oak trees and little oak shrubs and stuff, and then all of a sudden, just in the middle of it, there is a camp surrounded by peonies. When you're thinking about ways to incorporate interesting storytelling and world building into your worlds, don't leave out your forests. And while we're here, don't leave out your waterways either. A lot of people might want to just plant down a big bunch of trees and call it a forest, but forests are naturally going to spring up around things like lakes and rivers, and forests are going to be full of little forest streams and brooks. Now, in Minecraft, it's hard to make a little stream. You kind of have to make a big rushing stream like this, and it can be a bit of a pain. But still, trying to include these sorts of things in your forest are going to make them a lot more lively and interesting. You can even use them to break up little sections of your forest, or to separate the forest from the road that runs through it. These streams are also going to make your terrain feel a lot more realistic, as they tend to puddle and pool down through the natural valleys of your forest. I, for one, love including little ponds in my forest with streams leading out of them. Here you can see that there is a bit of a natural depression in the land, and so we have filled the kind of back part where the water isn't flowing with lily pads and tall grasses and stuff. There's a bunch of like reeds and fireflies around the river, and we even have some little bushes and shrubs and oak trees around here. And then where it gets closer to the edge here, there is no grass because it's moving faster, and it eventually goes down and connects into this big river. Having these little streams is also just going to make the rest of your terraforming in your world feel a lot more realistic, as there are all these water sources running into your rivers instead of them just appearing out of nowhere. We're back in the test world because I want to talk about deciding on a season. Now, this is really important for basically your entire Minecraft world, and I don't think enough people do it, so we're going to talk about it properly. Real life is highly seasonal, whether it's the plants, the crops, the animals around you, what kind of activities you're doing, whether it's the snows or it's the rainy season or the dry season, whatever it is, humans, and everything around us work on a seasonal system. One good example is, what are you planting in your Minecraft fields? So if it's the middle of autumn, you might want to have a bunch of fallow fields, that is, fields that are just empty for the time being. Whereas if it's in the winter, there might be snow on your fields, or there might be winter wheat planted in the soil if it's not too snowy. In the summer, you might see things like oats and rye and barley and all sorts of things like vegetables growing. And for your forests, well, if it's the middle of autumn, you might see a bunch of golden colors, or you might see a bunch of red colored trees. You'll also notice that in autumn, there aren't a lot of brand new saplings on the floor. So if you're trying to create a forest that's set around this time of year, you're probably not going to want to include a bunch of these little tiny trees in your plans. On the other hand, if you're building a forest that's set in the middle of spring, well, you're going to want a bunch of these. And moreover, they might even have different leaf colors. Maybe you're building a springtime forest and you want to include a bunch of bright green pine needles, in which case you're going to want to replace some of your spruce leaves with acacia leaves. And again, you're going to want to include a bunch of these little ones and maybe not so many of these bigger trees. On the other hand, we were just talking about waterways, and maybe your waterways are going to be actually dried and emptied out if you're building around the dry season. Or if you're building in the early spring, well, your trees might have a little bit of snow underneath them. So maybe this is one way that you can show that spring is still in the middle of bloom and we haven't quite made it to summer yet. In any case, deciding what season specifically your forest is in is going to be really important. Now, this doesn't have to be the season that your entire world is in. If you want to have different areas of your world be kind of mix of spring and summer and fall, that's perfectly fine, as long as they're consistent within themselves. That's what really matters. Now we've made it through the 10 main tips of this video, but I just have one last one, which I think some of you specifically might find useful, and that is, if you have access to commands or to mods, try changing the biomes around your forest. For instance, for my willow trees, I like to make this a little bit of a pale oak biome so that we can get some of these grayish looking leaves and not those kind of super bright colored vines. On the other hand, if you want to make your forest seem darker and deeper than it is, try replacing some of this biome with dark oak, which is going to tint your grass to be just a little bit darker, and it's going to make it feel more like the middle of a forest, even if it isn't really all that dark. And of course, here we have a meadow biome, which makes our grass look this kind of nice paley color, and it makes our water look this beautiful, deep, dark blue. That is going to do it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, comment down below if you have any suggestions or questions, and feel free to check out the Discord server in the description down below. See ya.